So what does it actually mean to live a good life? Is it really just about following a long list of rules? Well, the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, he offers a totally different and honestly a pretty radical idea. We're going to break it all down, looking at the powerful vision for ethics in Ephesians chapter 5, and we'll be leaning on the insights of Dr. Dan Darko.
And boom, that question right there, it gets to the absolute heart of Paul's message. Most of us, we think of ethics as this big checklist of do's and don'ts, but Paul wants us to just set that aside for a minute. What if the goal wasn't just to follow the rules, but to become like someone you love and admire? Kind of like a kid learning from their parent. And that right there is our first big idea. See, Paul doesn't frame Christian ethics in these stiff legal terms, like a prosecutor trying to win a case in a courtroom. No. Instead, he puts it right in the middle of a family home.
I mean, just think about the difference in that mindset for a second. Dr. Darko points out that a courtroom, it's all about fighting, right? It's about proving who's right and who's wrong. It's a zero-sum game. But a healthy family? That runs on something totally different, kinship and respect. The goal isn't to win an argument, it's to deepen a loving relationship. And that is the crucial framework Paul wants us to get our heads around. So this whole family idea, it leads directly to the central command of the whole passage, to be imitators of God. But not like you're the subject of some distant king, but like you're a beloved kid, imitating a parent you love.
Okay, so when we hear imitating God, that can sound, well, pretty abstract, right? But for Paul's original audience in the Greco-Roman world, this was a super familiar idea. It was actually common practice to model your life after the best qualities of a specific god.
So, for example, someone might try to be more loving, like Aphrodite, or maybe embrace the, let's say, celebratory side of Bacchus, the god of wine. The point is, people would consciously pick a deity and really try to embody their most defining traits. And this wasn't just some religious thing either. Even respected philosophers like the Stoic Musonius Rufus argued something really similar. He basically said, hey, humans are unique, we resemble the divine, so our whole purpose should be to live a life that reflects that amazing image. And this is where it all comes together. This is the crucial point. When Paul says imitate God, he's not being vague at all. He zooms right in on one single specific virtue, love. And for Paul, this isn't some mushy feeling. He gives us the ultimate practical example of what this love actually looks like, the self-giving sacrifice of Christ.
Okay, so to really hammer home what this life of love looks like, Paul does something really smart. He doesn't just tell us what to do, he shows us exactly what not to do. He draws this incredibly sharp line in the sand, creating a stark moral contrast between a life of love and a whole list of really destructive behaviors. And you can see the battle lines drawn right here. On one side, you've got these 6 specific vices, and Dr. Darko helpfully groups them into sexual sins and speech sins. But get this, look what he puts on the other side. It's not 6 matching virtues, nope. It's just one singular, powerful countermove, Thanksgiving. So let's really think about these 6 vices for a second. Sexual immorality, greed, crude joking, what do they all have in common? They're all about taking something for yourself, aren't they? Taking pleasure, taking possessions, or just taking a cheap laugh at someone else's expense. But Thanksgiving, gratitude, it's the total opposite. It's a virtue that's all about recognizing a gift you've received. It's about appreciation. It doesn't take, it sees what's been given, and it gives back thanks and honor. It's a game changer. So after laying out this specific contrast between vices and virtue, Paul kind of zooms out to this huge, powerful metaphor for the entire Christian life, this journey from darkness into light. And you have to pay attention to the words Paul uses here, because they are incredibly specific. He doesn't say you were just living in darkness. He says you were darkness. That's about your identity, not just your address, So the change isn't just a new location. It's a completely new you. Now, you are light. And when you have a new identity, you naturally get a different result. Dr. Darko explains that all those works of darkness, well, they're ultimately unfruitful. They're shameful, they don't produce anything worthwhile. But light just naturally produces fruit, goodness, rightness, and truth. And this leads to a really surprising, kind of counterintuitive conclusion about how to deal with all that darkness. Paul's logic here suggests that the job of the light isn't to get in a fistfight with the darkness. Its job is just to be light, to shine. The mere presence of a moral, light-filled life automatically exposes the works of darkness for what they really are.
So, where does this all lead? It all builds up to Paul's final, urgent call to action. And it's not a gentle suggestion, it's a command. Wake up.
Yeah, this line right here, it's like a poetic rally cry, isn't it? It's a call to shake off that sleepiness and actually live this new identity as children of light, to not just have it in theory, but put it into practice.
And according to Dr. Darko's analysis, this call isn't mainly for people outside the faith. It's for Christians who might be, slumbering, the ones who've gotten a little drowsy or complacent. It's a reminder that their faith is meant to be active and visible, to make a real difference in the world. And just like that, Paul's words from thousands of years ago echo right into today and become a direct, personal challenge for every single one of us. It really makes you stop and ask yourself, in my own life, am I asleep at the wheel or am I actually shining a light?